There are not many people in our corner of YouTube that are not aware of the ongoing debates between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. Each has a dedicated following, whose collective support for their preferred contender might be described as verging on tribalism. Both are impressive intellectuals, but in radically different ways. There are two very distinct worldviews being exposed in these debates. This difference in perspective was brutally exposed in the recent Waking Up with Sam Harris podcast, when the conversation stalled over a simple definition and meaning of a common term. Many were frustrated at the inability of Peterson and Harris to make progress beyond what many perceived as a trivial matter. What do we mean when we use the word truth? But apparently it's not as simple as one first assumes it to be. In fact, this matter occupied Harris and Peterson for much of the first podcast, and even extended into a second, and has now spawned a series of debates. This inability to progress beyond a simple definitional issue gives us a hint that the issue is fundamental in nature, and it relates to a philosophical difference. Matters of truth, knowledge and belief have a dedicated branch of philosophy called Epistemology, which is a rather ugly word. But the issue is that Harris and Peterson have built their worldview on very different epistemic systems, and it is this difference that is the source of the disagreement, not just the meaning of a single word. Now, at this point, the debates are ongoing. They have completed two, and there are another two pending. The problem is that at the moment we do not have access to the discussion. For some reason, no audio or video has yet been released, so we only have third-party opinions as to the content and what points of agreement may have been reached, or if there has been any significant movement in the views of either Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris. So in this video, we shall have to restrict ourselves to considering the general points and surrounding issues, which still leaves us with a vast range of potential topics. But let's stick with the issue of truth, because that in itself seems central to the disagreement. In fact, I would suggest that without an adequate account of truth, all matters relating to it, including belief, knowledge, faith, and the nature of evidence itself, can be open to serious challenge. In everyday conversation, we are not so much concerned with definitions, and often conflate quite different terms. A favourite example of this is the use of state, country, and nation, often taken to refer to the same thing, although these terms are distinct. In everyday use, people often use them interchangeably, but in some fields, such as geography, politics, and law, they're used far more carefully. The same can be said for epistemic systems. Some only differ in subtle ways, others differ at a very fundamental level. These epistemic systems are often labelled with strange but vaguely familiar names, such as rationalism, evidentialism, empiricism, and pragmatism, to name a few, and I would suggest that none of them are entirely free of problems. There is no single epistemic system that describes manifest reality in a grand, all-encompassing cognitive framework, but not all modes of thought are equal, and some seem to describe our shared reality better than others, while others seem to serve no other purpose than obfuscating the obvious. In the same way as a scientist does not commit himself to a particular branch of logical reasoning, so must we be wary of committing to a particular epistemology. To understand why this might be significant, and perhaps get an appreciation as to why there is an entire branch of philosophy dedicated to epistemology, let's explore some issues and see why the meaning of truth is significant, and why it seems to present such an intractable problem for our protagonists. When I used the example of state, country, and nation, I was using well-defined terms, but those terms are abstractions. These abstractions, like many, we can represent in the real world by use of boundary markers, borders, or lines on a map. We can represent number by use of symbols, usually by use of Arabic numerals. In the same way, we might represent truth symbolically, and often do so in tabular form. But how would we manifest an abstract concept such as morality, How would we represent morality in the world? And if we could, what would it look like? This gives us a hint that we are discussing two subtly different kinds of abstraction. There have been several attempts to develop a kind of moral algebra to represent moral terms as symbols, but these attempts have been less than satisfactory. It would be difficult, perhaps impossible, to build any system of reasoning, axiomatic or not, if we could not determine what we might mean by truth. We need to be able to point to an absolute truth, something that cannot be denied, in order to begin building our epistemic cathedral, a truth that even the most radical skeptic would find it difficult or impossible to doubt. We already know what this absolute truth is. That is, existence itself. In 1641, the French philosopher René Descartes, in his philosophical treatise, Meditations on First Philosophy, wrote, "I am, I exist," which in later works he rephrased as cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. I exist is a necessarily true statement. It is the foundational statement of rationalism, but it is also common in many other epistemic systems, which often diverge at later points of reasoning. The nature of existence does not impact on the truth of the statement. You might be an isolated part of a larger cognitive entity. You might be a brain in a jar being deceived by a mad scientist, or the deluded victim of a malicious demon. There is one thing at least sane people can agree on: their own existence, even if they might posit they are the only thing that exists, or that their existence is a delusion. They have to admit that they do exist, that the fact that they think, regardless of the nature of their existence, has to be true. Conceding the obvious, that we exist, is not sufficient in itself to begin constructing our epistemic cathedral. We need to make some fundamental presuppositions. The first, and perhaps most important, is that at least some of our perceptions are accurate for most of the time. In other words, they match or correspond with reality. The next presupposition is that any belief that we have about reality is based on our perception of reality that is persistent, at least on scales that match our ability to directly perceive it. We can then move on and presuppose that the reality we perceive is itself consistent, which is something that physicists in particular desperately hope is true. We could go on, but I think you get the point. Truth is not just incidental, but is the foundation of nearly all Western epistemologies. It is the keystone of Western thought and science itself. Absolute truths might be common in mathematics, but rare in reality. Mathematicians can make pronouncements with some certainty, which is a luxury denied to most scientists and philosophers. This is because our language is pregnant with terms that quantify and qualify truth at a fundamental level. We unconsciously make distinction between opinion, belief, and knowledge, and certainty is a measure of what we hold to be true. Epistemic humility is, I believe, a virtue, but one grounded in the realization of limitation. But even so, we have to be wary when someone, for whatever reason, seeks to redefine the nature of truth itself. Epistemologies, for all their shortcomings, are attempts to define the nature of truth, not to determine its nature. This leads us back to the Jorden-Peterson and Sam Harris debate. When Peterson refers to Newtonian truth or Darwinian truth, his meaning is uncertain, and there is little value in his pointing to complexity to avoid addressing the uncertainties he has introduced. There are entire philosophical treatises devoted to the nature of truth. I have no doubt that a philosopher could dedicate an entire lifetime to the study of truth, but I have yet to meet a philosopher who could not give a simple account of what they understand to be the nature of truth, and argue their preferred epistemology from first principle. Newtonian physics is classical, it is mechanistic in nature, and Darwinism, one assumes, references the biological or evolutionary nature of human existence. Whether biology at its most fundamental is not mechanistic might be debatable. So why make this particular distinction? Why not Einsteinian truth? In other words, why is Dr. Peterson using these terms to qualify the nature of truth? Or to put it another way, evolution may or may not be true, But what does it mean to say that truth is evolved, or that truth is evolutionary or Darwinian? It's been suggested that Peterson's Newtonian truth relates to realism, and that Darwinian truth is pragmatic truth. Now, realism and pragmatism are both epistemologies, but each takes a slightly different view on truth. There is a tension between these differing worldviews, and it's not a minor issue. Realism, I would suggest, holds that truth must at least have some correspondence with reality. The accuracy or fidelity of correspondence might be challenged, but the pragmatist theory of truth is quite different. The pragmatic theory of truth holds that something is true if it is useful to believe. For the dyed-in-the-wool pragmatist, and Jorden Peterson seems to be taking this position, utility is the essential mark of truth. Both Peterson and Weinstein have referred to metaphorical truth, and metaphorical truth, it would seem, is true simply because it's useful to believe it's true. But this seems to me a problem, because in the same way as something may be comforting but not true, it is also the case that something might be useful but untrue. When Peterson invokes unstated complexity, this can only lead one to suspect sophistry rather than sophistication, and given the great care in which Dr. Peterson uses language, the only conclusion one can come to is that this is deliberate. Both Weinstein's metaphorical truth and Peterson's Darwinian truth are cast from the same mould, using slightly different materials, each proffered for subtly different reasons. There is something of the old world prophet about Jorden Peterson, while Weinstein seems unable to recover from being marinated in left-wing ideology. Both need to decouple truth from manifest reality in order for their worldviews to be sustained in any meaningful way. When Dr. Peterson refers to the transcendent, it matters little how you define that term. The implication is that whatever he is referring to is not reality itself, but something else, something that is outside our shared reality, even in the Aristotelian sense, and it is this that Peterson seems desperate to avoid openly stating. We are left to ponder whether truth is an embodied performance that we interpret according to culturally mediated conceptual schema, as suggested by Dr. Peterson, or perhaps it is simply what is, as suggested by myself, which is more pleasing, which has more utility, Jorden Peterson's appeal to the transcendent, or a realist's habit of coupling truth to manifest reality. When we listen to Dr. Peterson, we are presented with an impressive intellect, an insightful and analytical mind, but one that often argues from behind a thicket of metaphor and terminology that could well be mistaken for postmodernist nonsense. Like the classical philosophers, we have an amalgam of rational thought and impassioned superstition. He holds a can of worms in his hand, invites us to admire the label, but seems reluctant to open it, so that we might admire what wriggles within. We end our adventure at this point. I hope you found something of interest in this video. If you would like to support my channel, I now have a Patreon page. If you're unable to support my work through Patreon, then you can share, like, or comment. It's all good. Thank you for watching.